So I'll just begin. I'll introduce Professor Geoffrey Batchen. I think we've all read his incredibly beautiful books and heard him speak before. So his talk today is called Blindness and Insight, Photography and as Ruin. And after his keynote, he'll be interviewing the artist Ben Kalki, who's come from Berlin to be part of the symposium. And they'll open the day with the morning session. So I'll just welcome Professor Geoffrey Batchen.
Well, thank you everybody for coming out on a lovely, beautiful day, not like in Wellington where it's, as usual, freezing. And I just want to thank the whole team for inviting me to speak and, of course, making it possible for me to be here as one of a sizable Kiwi component. So it's also nice, I think, to have as the ACP's last show a kind of trans-Tasman effort as we're seeing today. Now let me just, there we go. So, as you know, we're gathered here today in this beautiful setting, which I understand is also under threat. So, as you'll see, it very much suits my theme that we're in an art school that's currently being threatened with ruination. We're here to consider questions and themes that arise from the Alchemists, the last exhibition to be shown in the current incarnation of the Australian Centre for Photography. Among other things, then, we might take a moment to ponder and consider the 41-year arc of this now venerable institution, founded to provide a vehicle for the study, display and teaching of photography at a time when, hard to believe, there was virtually no other such vehicles. Of course, its founders were themselves photographers, schooled in the demands of commercial photography and especially committed to its documentary and journalistic traditions. They were dedicated, in other words, to taking pictures of events in the world around them. Showcasing work that exploits alternative, sometimes even antique processes, and privileging abstract, inward-looking images, the Alchemist decisively replaces the humanist documentary of these founders with a display of photographs presented as things or events in themselves. These alchemical events have rendered photography as blind, at least to an outside world, and even as a medium in ruins, with little to see but the rubble left behind. Where once we would have been invited to see through photographs to actions that took place at some point in the past, now we are asked to look at photographs as enigmatically opaque surfaces resting stolidly in the present, or as traces of actions that took place directly on the paper or film itself. These photographs are self-declared as made rather than taken. So there are any number of ruins conjured by this exhibition. The ACP and its mission, the humanist traditions of photography and its documentary stream, and even the practice of photography itself. Prompted by this apparent photo apocalypse, my talk will try to trace a history for the photograph as ruin and ask what insights into the nature of the medium such a metaphor might make possible. The catalogue for the Alchemists, which as you heard is available outside and obviously is worth getting if for no other reason than it is the last ACP catalogue, at least at the moment anyway. The catalogue claims that the kind of work being shown in it is evidence of a global movement of artists. And certainly the theme of ruin seems to be everywhere at the moment. Elsewhere in Sydney, for example, Justine Varga has an installation at Artspace that also wreaks havoc, not only with photographs, which in her case have been walked over, spat on and savaged in various other ways, all to sublime effect, but also with the exhibition as a rational and ordered form of display. The strip of film from which Varga's exit has been derived was tortured over a 3-month exposure on her windowsill, and then again in the darkroom via various printing procedures, all to produce this glowering violation of traditional photography. It's a document of the artist's presence in a particular place, a manifestation of her physical interaction with the activity of photographing. To see this photograph as it is, one can no longer be allowed to see through it. Thus, one's sight is denied and allowed, all in the same gesture. That sight is restored, according to biblical tradition, by a laying on of hands, by the same touching that put out the lights in the first place. In Varga's work, this sacrifice of photographic vision turns what was once a mirror with a memory into something more like a memoir, into a confession that her love affair with photography is marked by a violence both tender and remorseless. In his 1990 exhibition catalogue for the Louvre, Memoirs of the Blind, The Self-Portrait and Other Ruins, Jacques Derrida studiously links the three themes of his title, blindness, self-portraiture and ruins, declaring them to be inseparable aspects of the creative act. Indeed, he argues that ruin is always already at the origin, that there is always a scribbling in place even before the first mark is made, on a piece of film or anywhere else. A ruin, he implies, is a necessary corollary to all acts of representation. And this, as we've seen, is certainly the situation with Varga's work. Blindness, self-portraiture and ruins. We could as easily be talking about one of the most famous photographs in the history of photography, a photograph that has nevertheless never been seen by its many interlocutors. Roland Barthes describes this photograph, the so-called Winter Garden photograph of his recently deceased mother, in considerable detail in his book, Camera Lucida. And I quote, "The photograph was very old. The corners were blunted from having been pasted into an album. The sepia print had faded, and the picture just managed to show two children standing together at the end of a little wooden bridge in a glassed-in conservatory, what was called a winter garden in those days," unquote. But then, despite proposing that something like an essence of the photograph floated in this particular picture, he refuses to reproduce it, claiming that for us it would be nothing but an indifferent picture. It's a brilliant rhetorical manoeuvre, of course, inviting every reader to project their own image of a lost loved one into the black void at the heart of his text. Empathizing with the grief-stricken author, we find ourselves crying over a photograph that isn't even there. Given the care with which this whole book has been composed, this effect is surely no accident. Indeed, a number of commentators have suggested that, just as Barthes decided to derive all photography, its very nature, from this one absent photograph, that there too, in that photograph's retraction in his book, should inquiring readers seek the essence of Camera Lucida. In that sense, the photograph of Barthes' mother must be made an absent presence in order to maintain the deconstructive dynamic that animates the whole book. As Jacques Derrida might put it, such a rhetorical gesture enacts an erasure that allows what it obliterates to be read. We could equally regard Barthes' figuring of the all-important Winter Garden photograph as a mirror of his relationship to his mother. After all, his lengthy discussion of it tells us much more about him than it does about her. The whole book, you could say, is a self-portrait. And as I've suggested, at the heart of that self-portrait is a ruin. On December 29, 1978, Barthes records in his diaries that he had received a reproduction photograph of this Winter Garden photograph, which he will henceforth keep, as he says, in front of me on my work table. He mentions this reproduction again in the entry for January 20, 1979, some 3 months before he actually begins to write the book that became Camera Lucida. As if to put the matter beyond doubt, a posthumous publication titled Morning Diary reproduces a photographic portrait of Barthes by Francois Lagarde, showing Barthes sitting at his desk on April 25, 1978. According to his own notations, Camera Lucida had been begun 10 days before. Behind him on the wall hang 3 frames. They contain a picture of a house in Urt, that is U-R-T, on the left, a picture of camels on the right, and in the centre, a vertical reproduction of the famed Winter Garden photograph. What are we to make of this holy trinity of images? For a start, we have to grapple with the pictorial fact that this most essential of all photographs, at least for Barthes, is apparently accorded equal value with some rather nondescript pictures of a house and some camels. True, like the photograph of his mother, these are also intensely personal mementos of home. His mother raised him in the village of Urt in Bayonne and was buried there, and of the exotic Orient, with Bart spending time in Egypt and Morocco. Of course, this photograph of Bart's most beloved photograph is but one more of his retractions, because we can in fact see nothing of it except its framing. Within that frame, the Winter Garden photograph itself remains a dark and mysterious blur. If anything, it resembles one of Alan McCollum's perpetual photographs, or perpetual photos as they were called, produced in the 1980s. Those indecipherable enlargements of framed pictures found on the walls of scenes photographed by this artist from his television screen. For the critic Craig Owens at the time, McCollum's work evokes the arid repetitions of consumer capitalism, but also the more elemental repetitions associated with memory and death. Thus, even here in this posthumous, unauthorised reproduction of Bart's reproduction, the themes of Camera Lucida continue to resonate and perplex. We are promised revelation, the truth of the matter, but are left in the end to contemplate yet another of his pregnant voids, another bout of blindness, another ruin. Already then, we can see that an exploration of the ruined photograph is going to be a rich experience, but also potentially a troubling one. In Varga's case, the logic of her presentation at ArtSpace is an extension of her work in the studio and the laboratory, those places where photographs are produced, but also tested, transformed, rejected, torn, reprinted, found wanting, and often even destroyed. It's a place, in other words, where the ruined photograph is a commonplace, where the ruin comes first, where a photograph is ruined many times before it is declared whole and ready for public exposure. All this is a reminder of things usually suppressed in an exhibition of photographs, of the processes of trial and error that take place in private, sometimes even in the dark, blindly, of the labour of taking and making, of the test strips that evidence this labour, strips that are shredded and scattered about the studio but never make their way into the gallery, or indeed into history. It'd be interesting, I think, an interesting challenge to attempt a history of the test strip, of those pieces of photograph judged to be necessary but incomplete, to be not quite photographs because they are nothing but photographs, because they signify nothing but themselves. Here are some made by William Henry Fox Talbot in about 1841, testing the visual effects and various colours possible of his then new colour type process. Such testing has, of course, been a mandatory procedure throughout the history of photography. John Herschel's notebooks, for example, these from February 1839, are full of the remnants of his systematic experiments with different light-sensitive solutions, including some derived, by the way, from vegetables, carefully annotated and numbered, and you'll note, retained for future reference. A later example consists of 4 painterly horizontal stripes of light-sensitive solutions, again deployed to test their relative reactions to different colours. The bottom stripe, with its liquid intimations of blue and violet, is comprised of an iron compound. In a paper delivered to the Royal Society on June 13, 1842, Herschel promised a photographic process involving a similar iron salt that resulted in Prussian blue images. He decided to call this cyanotype. So here we see, you might say, in the ruins of these test strips, the origins of cyanotype. We also have some of the test strips made by the French photographic pioneer Hippolyte Bayard, as he sought to invent his own photographic process in early 1839. The first page of an album devoted to his photographic experiments consists of 2 segmented sequences of coloured rectangles, a kind of test pattern of light-sensitive chemistry. Although not recording anything other than their own sensitivity to light, and thus failing to prove the efficacy of his direct positive process as a way of automatically making pictures, Bayard nevertheless kept and mounted these experiments. To him, it should be noted, they were all simply photographs, whether or not an image was discernible in them. On his 3rd page, we are showing more complex examples, including some that are almost painterly in their curvilinear swathes of hues. These rectangular fields of colour are followed on subsequent pages by photographs of plaster statuettes and even of Bayard himself. The album therefore obeys a logical narrative. opening with photography's self-portraits before proceeding to those of the photographer. Or perhaps that is the distinction this album in fact undermines. After all, the total ensemble is meant to represent Bayard in his efforts to be recognised as photography's inventor. This album and its photographs are his surrogate, his supplement. His photographs represent him even when they don't. Once again then, ruination, origins and self-portraiture prove to be inseparable states of being. But this is a truism that can be repeated about virtually every one of photography's favoured origin points. We know, for example, that the early photographic experiments of Tom Wedgwood and Humphrey Davy, discussed in an essay they published in 1802, were all ruined as soon as they were made. As the two men were unable to prevent their light-sensitive solutions from continuing to develop and go black, none of their photographs has survived. A substitute first photograph in many publications is this one, a still-life daguerreotype of a corner of his own studio by the Frenchman Louis-Jacques Mundet Daguerre, dated, on the basis, I have to say, of almost no evidence, to 1837. Made to demonstrate the efficacy of his new daguerreotype process, it's yet another self-portrait and another sort, you might say, of test strip. It's also another ruin. For this image, let me just go forward. For this image has been virtually illegible for many years. As you can see, it in fact can't be seen. This origin is now nothing but a blank rectangle of silvered copper. What we see in books is invariably a reproduction of the gelatin silver copy print that was made either in 1925 by the historian Georges Potenet or in 1936 by a photographer named A. Dumas Satigny for Beaumont Newhall when he was writing the first edition of his History of Photography. Once again, all that can be found at the origin as self-portrait is a kind of blindness, is a ruined photograph, a mirror reflecting back whoever looks into it. Of course, if we really want to examine some ruined daguerreotypes, then it is to vernacular examples that we should turn. The delicate and mysterious chemistry of the daguerreotype, merely held in fragile suspension on the surface of its copper plate, is prey to unpredictable deformations and continued development, resulting in the suffusing of the image with a fog of unruly, excessive photographicness. Not so long ago, a number of daguerreotypes taken by Southworth and Hawes in Boston, some of which are now insured for $1 million apiece, developed such a fog during an exhibition. This has led to new prohibitions on the display of daguerreotypes in American museums, thus ruining a number of planned exhibitions, including one of my own, and a massive research project that now aims to find out why such deformations have occurred and, of course, if possible, to reverse them. The French-born photographer Antoine Claudet was one early practitioner who was acutely interested in every aspect of daguerreotyping, from the optics of the camera and its lenses, to the chemical solutions necessary for light sensitivity, to the way the chemical reactions coagulated on the surface of the silvered copper plate. Here's a self-portrait from 1842. An essay published in the Literary Gazette in December of 1841 reported Claudet's rather remarkable observations of the surface of the daguerreotype as follows, and I quote, "He compares the daguerreotype surface, when viewed through a powerful microscope, the darker parts to the starless heavens, the gradations of tints to the constellations and stars, according to their numbers and assemblage, and the brighter portions, composed of a multitude of globular molecules of mercury, to the Milky Way, thickly studded with myriads of luminaries," unquote. Everything, it seems, the whole cosmos, can be found, not just in a grain of sand, as William Blake once imagined, but also in the grain of a photograph, if one looks closely enough. This could well be the primary thesis of my talk today, and perhaps also the primary thesis of the Alchemists as an exhibition. But of course, the Alchemists is all about art, about the insights into life, including the life of photography, that are supposedly special to art and to artwork. So perhaps we should turn blindly away from the vernacular and towards the light, or at least towards the history of the avant-garde that has made exhibitions like the Alchemists possible. In photographic practice, that avant-garde was inaugurated, has its origins in the Dada art produced in response to the First World War. Christian Schad, for example, a German artist who in 1919 was living in Geneva, is usually credited with being the first to reinvent the cameraless photograph as an avant-garde practice. Schad had gone to Switzerland from his native Germany to avoid having to fight in the war, and he joined the anarchist Dada movement while he was living there. In this particular context then, Schad made a series of cameraless photographs by placing bits of detritus, often rubbish he found in the streets, including balls of dust and sheets of newspaper, under glass on a sheet of light-sensitive paper, and then leaving this ensemble of paper and objects to develop on the windowsill of his apartment. The gesture, a deliberately offensive abandonment of skill, precious material, or meaningful subject matter, aimed to produce an art that was entirely anti-establishment, perhaps even anti-art. It was art as a form of ruin. To that end, Schad, best known as a painter, used printing out paper, probably employing a batch of paper sold for the making of homemade postcards. If you've ever seen them, they're small and they're brown, and that's why it's actually postcard printing out paper. That because he's not a photographer, he doesn't know anything about darkrooms, he was able to buy this stuff in the local shop and use it in his own apartment. He thereby appropriated a vernacular amateur practice to his own artistic ends. This meant that he could watch the image develop in sunlight as it happened. He would simply stop the image from developing further when it looked ready. He then placed the paper in a gold-toned fixative bath, eventually cutting the sheets of exposed paper into abstract shapes in order, he said, to, and I quote, free them from the convention of the square. In a short time, Schad had made about 30 of these evocative yet enigmatic abstractions, all of them quite small, at about 6 by 8 centimetres in size. So here we have another manifestation then of the photograph as ruin. And nor does the ruination end there. For Schad left Geneva for Munich in 1920, leaving his photographs with his friend Walter Cerner. Cerner then forwarded them to the Dada theorist Tristan Tzara, who had expressed an interest in publishing some of them. Schad would never be in possession of these photographs again, and only returned to the making of shadowgraphs in the 1960s. In a sense, this is the end of his photographic career. Unbeknownst to Schad, Tzara sent a number of his photographs to Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1936, and playfully called them shadowgraphs in the accompanying letter, which is where the word comes from, in case you've wondered at its origins. They were then included in Barr's influential 1936 exhibition, Fantastic Art, Dada and Surrealism. You're seeing a page spread here, and as you can see, that's why they're called shadowgraph here in the catalogue. Reproduced in the catalogue and then purchased by the museum. So this is how these photographs, so familiar to us today, actually became known in the greater art world some 20 years and more after they were made. An equally pertinent historical touchstone for the Alchemists might be the work of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and his efforts in the 1920s to formulate a kind of syntax for photography. His own work set out to explore systematically what he took to be one of the basic elements of the photographic process, to use his phrase, the fact that photography depends, before all else, on the light sensitivity of a chemically prepared surface. Once again, you'll note that, of course, Moholy-Nagy was a metal worker. He was hired at the Bauhaus subsequent to the making of this photograph. But as a metal worker, he had no photographic skills. So once again, he actually bought postcard paper at the local printing out postcard paper. You can see that these iconic, canonical images in the history of photography were actually have postcard stuff printed on the back, and which is again why they are small, postcard size and brown, because that's the look of printing out paper. Putting aside the camera, he produced numerous photograms that demonstrated the possibilities of light composition. I'm quoting him again. The possibilities of light composition, in which light must be sovereignly handled as a new creative means, like colour in painting and sound in music, unquote. He sought to make visible, in other words, photography's particular conditions of representability. One late example, titled Diagram of Forces, a picture almost impossible to describe in pictorial terms, comes with a handy description of its mode of production, written in pencil by the artist on the back. And I quote, "A light-sensitive paper was made wet, squashed, and exposed to light. The result is a diagram of forces projected on the flat sheet," unquote. As you can see, Moholy-Nagy also includes instructions for his printer. "For the cut maker, please print it hard so that you get some white." Here we see his conceptual rigour being tempered by aesthetic concerns, a balancing act no doubt familiar to many artists. And I know, of course, Lisa and I know, Lisa Clooney, who's here, has tried to reproduce Moholy's wet paper process, so certainly in conversation we could talk to her about her insights into how, in fact, he might have gone about making these kinds of pictures. Of course, once the work of these pioneers became well known, everyone wanted to do it, or something like it. A number of Czech artists, for example, explored more extreme aspects of a surrealist attitude to the photograph. František Povolný melted the photographic emulsion on his glass negatives and then printed the result using an enlarger, exhibiting them in 1934 as photographics. Other mid-century Czech artists, including this one, Miroslav Hák, splashed, dripped or spread developer, fixer and other chemicals directly onto photographic papers, recording a gestural action made all the more random by the unpredictable chemical reactions that were involved. Beginning on this course in 1937, Hák gave these photographs the generic title Structage, perhaps seeking to associate his work with the in-form aesthetic being promoted by Georges Bataille in the surrealist journal Documents. After the Second World War, we find quite a number of photographs being made that are best described as abstraction for its own sake, informed by the same existential and phenomenological reflections that informed abstract painting in the same period. And like abstract painters, makers of such photographs saw them in universalist terms, as if only in the dissolution of recognisable forms and the expression of an entirely individual subjectivity could truly collected truths be found. Born in Switzerland, Herbert Matter studied with Fernand Léger in Paris before working there and then in Switzerland as a graphic designer, during which he incorporated photographic images into his many posters. In 1935, like many Europeans, he moved to the United States, involving himself in the design and art worlds that he found there, with a special interest in the work of American abstract painters. He produced a number of experimental photographs during this period, deliberately designed to break with what he called the chains of documentation. These included a calligraphic image made in 1944 by tracing brushstrokes on a wet emulsion plate charged by an electrical current, and a series of sinuous painterly pictures, one of which is seen here, perhaps made by pouring chemicals on sheets of glass already marked with a resist. One thing I should say, many of the pictures I'm showing you, and many of the pictures in the exhibition, the means of their making remains very enigmatic, and surely this is part of the work, part of the effect of the work is to make it difficult for us to work out precisely how they were made. So I've asked the dealer about this, and he also has no idea how this was made. So it's good to be in conversation with artists today, because perhaps you guys can guesstimate how he might have produced such a picture. I'll tell you one clue is that there are multiples of this image. So presumably, yeah, it has a glass matrix, I'm assuming glass, from which multiples could be printed. But how that matrix was prepared, topic of conversation. Light Drawing, 1943. As Herbert Matter wrote in Arts and Architecture magazine in 1944, and I quote, "In exploring the various photographic processes themselves, and here lies infinite possibility to control, to liberate, to create visual sensation. Drawing with light, solarization, photograms, or other direct impressions on positive or negative material, etc. Indeed, with the exploring of these means, photography achieves an independent existence with no needed material from without, providing in itself an endless source of inspiration," unquote. Could almost have been the catalogue essay for the Alchemists. Here's another post-war example, in this case produced in 1949 by the Hungarian-born photographer Georgi Kepes after he moved to the United States. Kepes published a series of interdisciplinary books in this period concerned with what he called the language of vision. One with this same title was published in 1944, insisting that, quote, "Visual communication is universal and international. It knows no limits of tongue, vocabulary, or grammar, and it can be perceived by the illiterate as well as by the illiterate. By the illiterate as well as by the literate. The visual arts are," he writes, "as the optimum forms of the language of vision are, therefore an invaluable educational medium." So you can also see that this shift to abstraction in the post-war period, as I say, it's driven by this kind of universalist impulse, that abstraction is the one, you might say, visual language that everybody, no matter what their language or cultural background, can equally appreciate perhaps because everyone's equally baffled, but nevertheless, there's this sense of, you might say, a United Nations of art, right? And so a lot of artists in a lot of different media move to various forms of abstraction. Informed by his own study of psychological theory, Kepes stressed the need for images that combine what he called transparency and interpenetration. And I quote, "The order of our time is to knead together the scientific and technical knowledge required into an integrated whole on the biological and social plane," unquote. Thus, even when they appear to be what we might call abstractions, Kepes's photograms were intended as an expression of the interdependence of natural and man-made structures, and as an advocacy for the interrelationship of art, science, and technology. By the 1950s, this kind of attitude to the photograph could be reasonably compared to the action painting described by the American critic Harold Rosenberg in 1952, and I quote, "At a certain moment, the canvas began to appear to one painter after another as an arena in which to act, rather than as a space in which to reproduce, redesign, analyse, or express an object, actual or imagined. What was to go on the canvas was not a picture, but an event." The history of experimental photography more and more begins to resemble a cavalcade of these events, manipulations of light and chemistry by photographers no longer content to passively wait behind a camera for a decisive moment to occur in the outside world. In Europe, this attitude was more explicitly informed by art informel, a term first coined in 1951 to describe a range of painting practices in which a kind of instinctive expression was associated with irregular and spontaneous dabs of pigment. It was as if, in the roughness of its surface treatment and the truth accorded to its materials, a picture was being given the opportunity to express its own inherent way of being. Does anybody guess, by the way, who made this photograph? Quick poll of the audience. Name of the artist. Very famous in the history of photography. I'll give you a clue for his fashion photography. Well, I'll tell you now. I'm glad you don't know. Makes me feel useful. It's by William Klein, who in fact was born in New York but moved to Paris in 1948 to become an abstract painter. And if you had those inclinations, that's where you went. Inspired by books that he happened to come across in a used bookstore by Moholy-Nagy and Kepes, in 1952, Klein began to make cameraless photographs, initially by cutting shaped holes in sheets of cardboard and moving these cards around over his photographic paper during a long exposure. That's what the results of which you're looking at here. The results, of course, were cameraless photographs animated by a mix of bold geometries and blurred, shadowy forms. A piece of card pierced by a thin rectangular slot could be agitated to leave gestural strokes of black on a white ground, or pivoted slowly around its axis a series of diamond forms. The interesting thing is that he then rephotographed them because they were quite small and put them up as a series of mural photographs, and William Lieberman, the editor of Vogue, happened to come across them and said, "Oh, we want to hire you at Vogue." And so he then, for the first time, picked up a camera and became the fashion photographer that no doubt you know. So this is an interesting history where, again, ruin is always at the origin. Another example of this kind of artist was Bronislaw Schlob, working in Poland in the late 1950s. Between 1957 and 1961, Schlob made over 200 cameraless photographs in his native city of Poznan. He called them photograms, but this word hardly begins to convey the process of their making. He worked directly on a glass plate or a sheet of celluloid, adding chemicals to this substrate, soaking it in warm water or setting fire to it, but also painting, scratching, drawing, or pasting strips of tar paper, wire, filler compound, or bits of metal sheet onto that substrate. He then printed the result, sometimes by contact printing and sometimes using an enlarger. The images he ended up with evoke a variety of forms, from organic microorganisms to crazed ceramic glazes. The textured, almost haptic quality of the surfaces encourages an association of his work with contemporary matter painting rather than with photography. Some Polish critics used the term anti-photography to describe this tendency that they saw in his work, while others complained that Schlob's work lay outside of photography altogether. Of course, we're talking about a context in which socialist realism is the prescribed style. They wrote, "It's an art autonomous, independent of nature, born in them in the imagination and unverifiable through nature, all of which, of course, were in fact negative comments on Schlobb's work. This quick traipse through the history of experimental alchemical European photography of the mid-20th century could well be bookended by two series of exhibitions. The first consisted of a series of 3 exhibitions under the generic title of Subjective Photography, staged in Saarbrücken in 1951, Munich in 1954, and Cologne in 1958. And the second was a series of exhibitions from the late 1960s in Germany and Switzerland that sought to establish a niche for non-objective or pure photography under the generic title Generative or Concrete Photography. So I just want to quickly introduce you to these two bookends, you might say. Motivated by the proselytizing of subjective photography's leading figure, the German artist Otto Steinert, photographers who exhibited under this rubric stressed the intervention of the creative and often manipulative hand of the artist. The ideas embodied in this movement emerged from an even earlier group of artists who in 1949 gathered together under the name photoform, described by one German critic, quote, as a nuclear bomb in the dung heap of the mass of German photography, unquote. This was all part of an effort to look back beyond the Nazi period and its utilisation of humanist reportage photography as a form of propaganda. So Steinert, in a sense, tried to jump the later 1930s and go back to the Bauhaus and Moholy-Nagy and that sort of experimental period and reinvent, particularly German but European photography, under these pre-Nazi auspices. And that sort of explains the motivation behind a movement that I suspect many of us in Australia, certainly myself, don't know that much about, but in Europe is a totally kind of central moment. So you get all kinds of weird things like this, basically a kind of luminogram, Lamps of the Place de la Concorde, 1952, by Steinert. In the catalogue for the second iteration of the subjective photography exhibitions, Steinert published a short essay outlining his motivations, an essay which again I think will sound very contemporary and very familiar. Quote, "Photography, if it is to be more than a stereotype reproduction of nature, must remember its elementary means of artistic creation in order to find through them a modern and specifically photographic mode of expression," unquote. To find that expression, Steinert advocated a search for what he called the absolute photographic creation. This, he suggested, and I'm quoting again, in its most advanced examples, does away with any reproduction of an object, or it dematerializes it by photographic variation processes, or abstracts it in the visual approach to such an extent that it becomes merely a constructive element, a constituent part of the composition, unquote. Pierre Cordier, a Belgian artist, still very much alive and working, invented a technique he called chymogram in 1956. On November 10th, as he remembers it, Pierre's one of these guys who remembers everything, down to literally the hour, in which images are induced from photographic paper without any exposure to light whatsoever. Cordier exhibited 3 such works, along with a cliché Verprint, in Subjective Photography 3 in Cologne in 1958. The earliest examples, this one's from 57, were made by pouring developer and fixer on slightly oiled photographic paper. His work of the 1950s therefore tends towards charts-driven painterly washes or enamel-like pools of pigment, as you can see in this example. But in subsequent decades, he continued to develop his techniques, sometimes producing all-over effects like an action painter, and on other occasions generating very precise geometric patterns, but all through the application of nothing but chemicals to his paper. Another artist who pursued this kind of approach to photography was the German Kilian Breyer, whose work was included in Subjective Photography 2. Some of Breyer's images, created through the folding of his photographic paper, suggest the degree to which he could maintain a rigid geometric control over his process. But other examples take on the character of a drip painting, being created by allowing rivulets of developer to flow across and stain his gelatin silver paper. This one, for example, is from 1953, 1955. A 1991 exhibition catalogue, which I was lucky enough to be gifted, Kilian Breyer Photographique 1953 through 1990, gave the artist an opportunity to make a provocative gesture in line with his dedication to the self-generated image. For when you open up this rather nice catalogue, you discover that he included in it a loose, unfixed piece of signed photographic paper that continues to develop every time it is exposed to light. which is why, of course, I can never actually show it to you, except here. It therefore inhabits this book that protects it like a ghost, unable to be seen, but always present nevertheless. Here's one more example, this time made by a German artist who went by a single name, Scharsheimer. In 1961, Scharsheimer published a limited edition book titled Light Graphic, or actually Licht Graphic, which I'm showing you here. That says Tom Giddeman, the New York dealer who sells both Herbert Matter and a lot of this mid-European material, including this book. Scharsheimer described the 10 unique prints gathered in the book as photochemical paintings, inducing their strange combinations of gestural calligraphic marks and organic-looking surfaces using only developer and fixer on gelatin silver paper. I mentioned another series of exhibitions that sought to establish a niche for non-objective or pure photography. In 1967, such an exhibition titled Concrete Photography and featuring the work of Roger Humbert and 3 Swiss colleagues was mounted in Bern. The following year, 1968, Generative Photography, which included the work of Pierre Cordier, Kilian Breyer and Gottfried Jäger, as you can see on your right, among others, opened in Bielefeld in West Germany. It showcased systematic modes of photographic production of a sort more usually associated with computer graphics. Indeed, part of the motivation of these exhibitions was to separate European photography from the aspirations of subjective photography, which had already become a bit of an embarrassment. So these photographers look back even further to Theo van Doesburg's Manifesto of Concrete Art, first published in 1930. Quote, "An element of a picture does not mean anything but itself," unquote. But also to the work of a then contemporary German philosopher by the name of Max Benz, whose generative aesthetic of 1965 opposed the concrete to the abstract, the first, he argued, being inductive and the second merely reductive. According to Benz, everything that is concrete is only itself. You're looking at an example by Roger Humbert from 1962, and as you can see, they're basically luminograms, that is, he uses a light source and moves it back and forth across the paper. Here's another example. These images, as you can see, have the look of a graphic process, and it's interesting to remember that the advent of computer graphics, which had just sort of come into the public consciousness, was in fact the inspiration for these exhibitions. How can you produce photographs by hand that have the look and are a response to computer graphics? Again, I'm showing you this history because it seems so present. I mean, it seems so much part of our current concerns, and yet you can see there is actually a history to the Alchemists that, of course, I think most of us are not very familiar with. I could go on, in fact, along these lines. It seemed important to place the Alchemists in a little history of photographic art that has some similar aspirations and interests. But of course, each of these predecessors had their own particular contexts and motivations, which I've just briefly touched on in each case. To be understood, each of them needs to be situated in the specificities of their own moment. In that sense, in my view, none of them can be properly described as abstract, because each of them is in fact about something quite specific. The curators of the Alchemists make a similar claim for the work in their exhibition, implying that all of this work is a self-reflexive response to what they call the age of the JPEG. In other words, they propose that this is an exhibition about the digital era, an era that has ruined, or at least transformed, a photography that now needs to be rediscovered through, among other things, a return to antique and/or handmade direct experimental processes of photographic production. This then is the context for the Alchemists. That is, this is the context for the Alchemists. Yes, it's yet another ruin, this time, of course, of a revered company and its varied range of products. It's official. Kodak is bankrupt. January 19, 2012. Pretty much yesterday. If we're looking for a convenient photographic metaphor for this particular ruin, we need look no further than the earthquake and tsunami that swept across eastern Japan in March of 2011. Over 19,000 people were killed during this particular disaster, and millions continue to struggle even now to recover from a natural disaster that was demonstrably exacerbated by our own modern society's voracious appetite for both housing and electricity. As it happens, this disaster left a kind of potent metaphor in its wake. 750,000 scoured and weathered Kodak snapshots, whose ghostly surfaces evoke the erasure of both the people depicted and the means of their depiction. And this double catastrophe is conjured, of course, by the ruination of the photographs themselves, with the image on each piece of paper seemingly eaten away as if by a fungus or disease. As the curators of the Alchemists suggest, a number of artists around the world are making work like the work in the Alchemists that is handmade and unique and draws attention to the advent of digital photography and its ruthless dematerialization of the photograph and perhaps even its toxic impact on our environment. Take, for example, a work made by the American artist Lynn Casabon between 2010 and 2013, in this work titled Diluvium. It comprises a grid of unique contact prints, with their imagery and the means of its production both being directly generated by the work's subject matter. Embedded in a simulated waste dump, and therefore covered with discarded cell phones and computer parts, as well as by organic material, expired sheets of gelatin silver paper were sprayed with baking soda, vinegar and water, sandwiched under a heavy sheet of glass and left in direct sunlight for up to 6 hours, 4 prints at a time. The chemical reactions that ensued left visual traces, initially vividly coloured and then gradually fading as they were fixed, of our society's flood of toxic consumer items, produced here by the decomposing after effects of those very items. Or consider the work of the German-born New York-based artist Marco Breuer. Although this artist adamantly denies that his work is in any way a response to the digital era, it nevertheless manages to confront us with a robust physicality, both in its materiality as a series of photographic objects and by way of the various erosive treatments to which these objects have been subjected by the artist. By folding, scoring, burning, scouring, abrading, and or striking his pieces of photographic paper, Breuer coaxes a wide range of colours, markings and textures from his chosen material. His are photographs that therefore actively involve and evoke the body of the artist and the process of their making. They are about nothing but that contiguity in the raw. Both touched and tactile, Breuer's photographs have themselves become surrogate bodies, demonstrating the same fragility and subtractive relationship to violence as any other organism. And like any other body, they also bear the marks of time, not of a single instant from the past, like most photographs, but rather of a duration of actions that have left accumulated scars. These are now witnessed in a perpetual present by the body of an observer suddenly made aware of its own inherent vulnerabilities. Breuer's work is, of course, part of a broader tendency on the part of contemporary artists to reflect in morbid terms on aspects of photography's past. The Australian artist Robert Owen, for example, better known as a painter and sculptor, has been collecting the stubs of strips of film since 1968. This one has the rather evocative title, Endings, Rothko Died Today, Kodachrome 64, number 21, 26th of February 1970, but printed as we see it in 2009. So Owen decided recently to print these end strips of film as a series of large colour photographs under this overall title, Endings, paying homage to this residue of the Kodak era in a chronological sequence of ready-made chromatic fields. You'll notice, of course, the reference to Rothko, and indeed we might recognise in it a kind of retro-modernism, a common characteristic, I have to say, of much contemporary photographic practice, sometimes turned to ironic effect and sometimes called on as part of an effort to retrieve the critical capacities of a bygone era, when art making still seemed to have a tenacious purchase on political and social life. It seems that many artists now see modernism as an unfulfilled project. In a way, they've come through the postmodern moment, and now we see a lot of artists looking back, a bit like Steinert, to the before it, back to the grand old days when modernism seemed to really promise something interesting. So they see modernism as the kind of unfulfilled project, and they seek to reinvigorate its promise of a link between radical perspectives and social transformations. Their photographs therefore look back in order to signify a future that never was, but still might be. Let me finish this brief survey with an acknowledgement of the work of the American artist Alison Rossiter, because after years of relative obscurity, Rossiter's work seems to be suddenly in fashion. It's been included in a number of recent exhibitions all around the world. Photographers have, of course, historically often felt the need to take their medium back to first principles as a way of setting recent history aside and starting again, and I've shown you any number of examples during my talk. I might go even further and say that they have periodically sought to put the meaning of photography into crisis, precisely in order to signal and respond to a greater crisis that is always already happening around them. In the case of Rossiter and artists like her, this has meant displacing photography's apparent transparency to moments from the past, its realist documentary capacities, in favour of a reflection on the photograph's objectness, on its presentness as a thing in the here and now. It's an attitude, in other words, that we also see in many of the works in The Alchemists. So of what does Rossiter's work consist? Since 2007, she's been buying old expired packets of unexposed film at auction or on eBay, now having the best private collection of such papers in the world. Papers that are replete, as you can see if you look at the ones on the desk in front of her, with evocative names like Darko, Deco, Psycho and Cello, some of them dating from as early as 1900. She then develops these expired, unexposed sheets in her darkroom, never quite sure what the resulting object image will look like. These ones expired in 1919. You might say that the photographs that result are comprised of nothing but their own photographicness. This particular one, inscribed Velox T4, expiry date October 1, 1940, displays, once again, a Rothko-like grid of pale impressions on a dark ground. But these are in fact the chemical traces left behind by the wrapping paper and envelope that once protected this sheet of photographic paper from light. We're looking then at an exposure to chemicals as well as to leaked light that has been 75 years in the making. All surface and no depth, the photographs that result from this practice are being generated by a unique, volatile, unpredictable relationship of light and chemistry without recourse to cameras or any kind of outside referent. By subsequently mounting this object in a frame, Rossiter presents photography as something to be looked at and not through, to be made, not taken. In the context of the digital disintegration of photography, this is a photograph, she insists, that is not of something, it is something. The question for us today, of course, is why should any of this matter? Well, first, it means that Rossiter's photographs exist almost entirely in the present and embody a duration of actions rather than an instant of time. And therefore the viewer themselves are brought into the present, if you like. The photograph refuses to allow us to drift back into the past once witnessed by somebody else. We are only exposed to the experience that we're having right here in front of us. Secondly, these photographs signify as traces of their own coming into being, rather than as designators of some prior outside thing or activity. As much as possible, they point only to themselves. In other words, the abstract appearance of Rossiter's work is not an invitation to experience some sort of transcendental state of grace, or a refusal to engage with the politics of representation. This, I would want to suggest, is an art practice that is self-conscious, but not self-absorbed. Undoubtedly melancholy and affect, Rossiter's overall series is titled Lament, after all. This is work that is all about photography itself, and that means, I'm going to argue, it is very much about something of consequence. Indeed, in obstinately offering us the other to the digital image, Rossiter is, of course, making art that is all about the digital age. It's an art that refuses to give itself up easily, and that asks us to think critically about what we are seeing in the gallery and perhaps also outside of it, including about the consequences of the post-industrial information economy in which we all now live. Given that context, artists making photographs of this kind today, including those chosen for The Alchemists, assume that the photographic medium is, and has always been, a politically charged field. To engage the visual and chemical grammar of the photograph is to dispute and challenge that politics at a very basic, almost elemental level. Apart from anything else, to make such photographs returns photography to a unique handmade craft and away from the automatic subservience to global capitalism and its vast economies of mass production and exploitation. In any case, by slowing down the photographic act, Many of these photographs also slow down our perception of this act. They ask us to pause a moment and to think critically about the various consequences of our current media culture. And with it, we might also spare a sad thought for the ACP and the culture it has for so long represented within our small community, and for the many, many people whose creative labour has made that representation possible over the past 41 years. What will arise from the ACP's ruins? What further insights can be derived from the photography that has been blinded, turned inward, made to reflect on itself and its histories? These are the questions that I hope you will all ponder during the remainder of today's conversations. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions, comments, disputations, contestations, and any other word that you happen to conjure. Shireen has a very big microphone to make your disputation hearable. Questions? Thoughts? Donna Lee Brett steps up to the plate.
Sorry. Oh, well, no one else is going to.
Yeah.
That was absolutely amazing. Thanks, Geoff. And,
It's all right, Donna. I pay you after the talk.
Okay, thank you very much. I've sent you the invoice.
Yeah, very good. New Zealand dollars, okay? Keep going.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's fascinating because there's a show on at the moment actually in the city as well by a young photographer called Cohen Young, where he uses photographic techniques in order to make paintings, and they're huge mirror-like images. And what's fascinating
I've heard that Todd McMillan has similarly painted his cyanotype chemicals.
Yeah,
I mean, a lot you can see historically and today.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of artists doing this kind of work.
That's right, exactly.
Although I have to say, I suspect many of the people making it today are unfamiliar with the history.
Oh, absolutely. And Cohen's one of them.
We don't know our history
really understand
very well.
or be aware of this, a lot of this information.
Yeah.
But what I found interesting about your talk is this idea about photography that we expect to see something that reflects our world around us, whether it's ourselves, and you're talking about self-portraiture, or whether it's objects in the world that we see familiar. And we think of photography as that indexical quality, that it should reflect something about ourselves, about our world. Yep. And the interesting thing about some of these photographs, and I'm thinking about Cohen Young's as well at the moment, is that all it reflects is, in fact, because they're very mirror-like surface, these particular photographs, is they reflect everything that is around them. It reflects the viewer in the photograph. And it was fascinating watching people being so engaged with the surface of these objects. And it's also amazing some of the things that you've shown here that are very much about the surface, and you talked about the surface a lot, but what it is that we expect to see, it is that we expect a photograph to do is constantly changing, and yet we constantly want it still to reflect us.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, I mean...
And it's just amazing the way you've
traditional,
done this.
I mean, when you think about it, what do traditional camera pictures do? They, as we've often heard, they reproduce a kind of Renaissance-derived perspectival sense of space. But that actually doesn't really tell you very much about why that kind of image is indeed entrancing in the Renaissance and now. And the reason, of course, is that kind of perspective makes us the centre of the picture. Everything, focuses on our eye. We replace God, which of course was the big shift in the 15th century. God is replaced, as in medieval pictures, hence the ability to have scattered narratives because God is the ultimate viewer. God is replaced by us, the human. And of course that's why we, I think, have embraced camera pictures even to the present, and why, what your, I think, question's asking is, why do we want that? And it's because, of course, we're very self-centered beings, and we embrace pictures that affirm us as the center of the universe. But what's disturbing about the kinds of pictures we've been talking about is that they displace that affirmation. We are no longer the center of the universes. It's possible that, as you say, that the ones that reflect you literally give you a mirror to look into. Perhaps they have that nice, again, they're self-portraits in effect, a ruined self-portrait. And I have to say, a lot of artists around the world, Liz Duchenne would be another one in the United States who's making that work that continues to develop and therefore is silvered and therefore, has that mirror capacity. that develops in the gallery while you're there with it and all this kind of thing. There's quite a lot of artists working like that.
And the attraction of some of this photography is that it undoes that. It's an undoing.
Some of it, when you actually see the surface disintegrate, so to speak, it disturbs you on a whole lot of different other levels as well, I think. Yeah. All right, that was just an opening for everybody else to come up with more considered questions. There you go.
Hi. My question was, in terms of the contemporary practices, one of the things you said was that they're really a response to digital and to the ways, I suppose, we use images now in a...
Well, let me just say, that's the premise of the Alchemists, at least as the curators propose it. But, for example, when I interviewed Marco Breuer, he was adamantly denied that context. He'd made his photographs before the advent of the digital, and he's never had any interest in it, and he doesn't see his work as a response to the digital. But, you never want to believe anything artists say, as you know.
But I was
what would they know?
Yeah. I was kind of reflecting on how, a lot of the contemporary practice isn't historically informed in terms of this tradition of experimentation, and even if it isn't in depth, in the same depth that perhaps painter education gives you that kind of...
People need to hire me. Oh, really? It's kind of dismaying the degree to which photographic history has withered as an essential component of photographic education, because, I've just given you a 50-minute talk. You can imagine over the course of a year, there's a very big history of what we're talking about.
Yeah,
but I've just tiptoed across here.
My question was, if contemporary practice isn't really historically informed,
yeah.
So
where's it coming from?
And historical practice wasn't really informed by, certainly wasn't really informed by digital practices because it's pre-digital.
Yeah.
Is there something else that that leads people to this consistently? Is there a pattern to historical and contemporary practices?
I was trying to suggest that historically, you find that every so often, a group of photographers goes back to first principles, as if in response to a crisis of some sort. Let's say the crisis of the Second World War and nuclear annihilation and all the rest of it. They go back and a response to fascism. They go back to, if you like, first principles, as if to put the meaning of photography in crisis in order as a way of responding to these other kinds of crises around them. So the question for us is, are we in the midst of a crisis, given that there are so many young photographers going back to first principles? It's too easy, I think, to recast what's going on in terms of a kind of, antiquarian avant-garde, which is a term that has been used elsewhere to describe this kind of return. I'm more interested in the way in which artists are returning to the most elemental aspects of photography, as if to really go back and investigate this medium, which, of course, in itself embodies, consumer capitalism in its entirety, and now embodies, the information age in its entirety. To work with photography is to work with everything. It's our entire digital industrial complex embodied in a representational form. So when artists start reflecting on it and dropping acid on it or scraping it or painting with it, of course they are working with that too. With all of those implications. So I'm saying yes, without them necessarily knowing that much about Moholy-Nagy. Nevertheless, you might say they share with that artist a sense that they are in a moment in which going back to first principles seems important. Now, so the question is, why? Now, the debate for today is whether the age of the JPEG, quote unquote, is enough, for us to say, oh yeah, that's what it's all about. Because I'm not entirely persuaded by that. Or whether it's other things. Perhaps, as I touched on in a couple of cases, all of the consequences of our current digital era, including climate change and toxic waste dumps full of cell phones and third world labour practices and a million other consequences of our cell phone cameras.
There's a sense in which you're implying that it's almost a negative reaction, or it's a necessary reaction to a bad situation. Instinctually, I'm kind of, the way that these practices end up working, it seems to me like the social realist approach is a response to social problems, whereas the kind of experimental approach maybe isn't a response to social problems, but a response to
Yeah. Don't you?
leisure, or those kind of more. It's I've got time. There aren't big problems. I'm going to have a play in the darkroom
Okay.
kind of thing.
I mean, you're right. There's two ways you can read this kind of work: as cop-out, or as, in fact, a more rigorous engagement with the issues than social documentary allows. So that's another thing we could talk about. All of these young artists who are going back and replaying these experimental modernist things, is it that they inherently recognise that social documentary as a mode of photographic practice just doesn't cut it anymore? Despite all of the issues around us, refugees and climate change, that kind of work just cannot get at the nub of the problem. It's just not as powerful a means of representing that crisis as, for example, dropping acid on your paper, or scratching it 1,000 times, or walking over it for 7 months, or whatever it might be. I mean, that's the question right now. We could say putting up that bit of paper in a gallery, who cares? The refugees keep flooding across our borders and this kind of work does nothing. But the question is whether the thousands of documentary photographs that we have seen of those refugees has done anything to our government's policies, to our collective understanding of the situation. I suspect it's done very little for our understanding of the situation. Of course, has done nothing to government policy. So I think in that context, a lot of young artists turn to other means to express their disquiet.
Thank you.
I guess off the back of that, looking for a way in as to why artists engage with these processes,
Yeah.
I was thinking of the notion of death, and you mentioned the body's vulnerabilities here. On the surface of some of these photographs, particularly with 20th century chemistry, there's a very yellow pallor of death. And I don't mean this in a pejorative sense. I mean this as a positive in a way, as an engagement with life. I remember a quote, Felix Nadar, I think it was, talked about the early practitioners, the Fox Talbots, as primitives. But he meant that in a positive way, people who were engaging with new ways of practice. They were as much about nature and the human being within nature. In thinking about your refugee line of thought,
Yep.
what do you think about these practices as a bodily engagement to bring us back to the self and a sense of, I guess, mortality in order to more appreciate life through these contemporary processes and, in a way, engage with politics on a personal level?
It's possible. It's a nice frame if you just want to sit in your dark room and do things.
Yeah, to me, that kind of closes off practice a bit. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I guess in thinking maybe about the first practitioners, there was, Fox Talbot used to play a lot with negatives. Negative, positive, negative, positive.
Yeah.
And that way of seeing was new to photography. But again, I for me, spoke about that kind of mortality, that kind of ruin in death as such. To me, that personalises it.
Sorry, are you thinking you're going to make a direct link between, let's say, the deaths of many refugees and this kind of work? I mean, are we talking about very specific deaths, or just the melancholic, romantic beauty and sublimity of death as a prospect?
More the latter. The former would be too much of a stretch, I think, without a direct reference.
Yeah. But the question would still be then, why death now? Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, I think you've cut to the point of my ramble.
Yeah.
Is this a reason why many practice? Forget the JPEG for a minute.
Yeah.
Is this a reason why many artists are going back to these things where you scratch and degrade and alter and you act with your hands rather than act with the keyboard? The notions of mortality within environmental degradation and diaspora and what have you seem to me to be a good response, a good way to, let's go back into the darkroom and make something and remember we're human beings.
I'm going to be torturing Ben Kalki in a minute. We'll ask him precisely this, just a warning, Ben.
Cool.
You'll be talking about death and, in fact, the whole refugee crisis and quite a few things. Yeah, but I do think this is a good conversation, because one of the nice things about today's gathering is I think it's primarily artists who are here. I'm just kicking things off as the academic in residence, but it's going to be interesting to actually hear from artists and to have conversations both formally and informally with artists about whether they are actually able to put their finger on what motivates them. I think often individually they're unable to actually.
Sure.
But it's interesting what curators do, or people like me do, is gather things together and say, isn't it interesting just how many people are doing these kinds of things and how many historical touchstones there are actually to the kinds of things that often young artists think have come out of, their heads fully formed, not realising, in fact, there's quite a long history for these kinds of responses to the photographic medium.
Lovely.
I think there was at least one other.
We might have one more question.
Okay, yeah, good. Keep an eye on the time, Shireen, because I have no idea what it is. Yes,
Hi,
ma'am.
sorry, thanks, Jeff. I just have a really simple question, which is that
I'm a simple man.
Yeah, it's very simple.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for talking about people returning to the darkroom and that kind of thing, and the ruin of photography. But it seems that there's, while there's a resurgence in all of these kinds of practices, there's a huge demise in actually the existence of the darkroom. So many darkrooms are closing down in art schools, TAFEs, and privately as well.
ACP.
ACP, perfect example.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering whether you have any insights on, firstly, how this resurgence has even been possible in that sort of climate, and then also how it might play out as darkrooms become even more rare.
Artists are very stubborn about these things. That's the thing. As soon as darkrooms have been declared defunct, that's where they want to all work. They're very perverse people, really. It's hard to see how the future's going to unfold. Apart from anything else, whatever our desires might be as far as darkrooms are concerned, soon certain chemicals and certain papers and certain technologies are just not going to be available. I mean, I know people who collect records and they go around, stoop sales in the States buying needles because, without the needles, the record players can't function. So they're stocking up on needles. And then I know photographers who have refrigerators full of now unobtainable papers. But all of those supplies are finite. So at some point, artists are going to have to find probably other means of making work. And, one of the questions we could consider is whether the sort of thing we're talking about now is a little blip. Precisely, at the very death of the darkroom, we find a lot of artists returning to it. And perhaps the next generation of artists are going to be returning to the darkroom of software and algorithms. And there is a whole other digital ecosystem out there that people with different skills than I have are capable of playing with and being experimental with and subverting and contesting and perhaps even making beautiful objects out of. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if the next generation of young students taught probably not with darkrooms but with computers and such like, are going to make a different kind of body of work again. The medium in that sense to me is kind of not that interesting, the question of the antiquarian media and so on. I mean, what's interesting to me is interesting work. So it won't bother me too much if darkrooms die and we only have digital left. That doesn't bother me at all. If interesting work is made, that will be the question. Can we make interesting work? So that remains to be seen, I think. Oh, yes. That's all right. That's coming. Get ready, Ben Carpy.
Thanks for that talk, Jeff. I feel like I'm a quite old person in this conversation because if I go back in time to the early days of the ACP and as a young photographer then, you're absolutely right that the main conversation in town as a photographer was to be a documentary photographer. And I remember having a first show in 1982 where I hung photographs. They were beautifully printed ones on fishing line, and I was told, I heard that Max Dupain had come in and said, "That is not photography."
Who was a critic at the Herald at the time, so his words actually mattered.
Because I was delighted.
Yes, of course.
But just being mindful of that, and I used to explore a lot of things with liquid light emulsion and stuff like that. There's a lot of other...
People were using plastic cameras back then. Do you remember that?
Exactly.
The Diana
so,
camera?
when I see a show like this, I mean, it's kind of a lovely
nostalgic.
Return. It's nostalgic,
yeah.
But what I wanted to say...
Julie, one of the interesting things is, I would get the feeling, not of all of them, because of course some of the artists in the show, like Kathy and Anne, are themselves, you might say, veterans of the field.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's a nostalgia without nostalgia. I don't think they have a historical memory for example, of the 70s or of Moholy-Nagy. It's a kind of interesting thing, this nostalgia without nostalgia. But anyway, go on.
Well, seeing that show made me realise that, we practice a fairly strong amnesia in this country, and that what it reminded me of is that wouldn't it be interesting to see a show, curated around a lot of that historical relationship in this country to why photographers moved and sort of experimented with a whole lot of other materials. And
well, Kathy Rogers' work is there, but it was like a taste of another show that one could put
yes,
together.
Yes, exactly. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
But, in my own case, the reason for that was also because, not only because I felt that photography couldn't just be, about taking pictures out there in the world, but, it was this idea that as a photographer you could be an artist and you could have a bigger discussion that we could call art, rather than it being too fetishistic around the
And you
medium
could be a woman artist. I mean, it's
and
interesting how many important women became art photographers.
Yeah, that's another whole story in itself, that a lot of women, and we know that, took up photography because they were totally disenchanted with the non-role they'd been given in mediums like painting and so on.
Yeah.
So I guess all I'm trying to say is I think when you mentioned the word politically charged, sort of my ears pricked up, because I felt in the time that other, artists like myself were working, we felt like we were really having to fight against something and to create a space where you could use photography in all sorts of ways other than just in that sort of
Now, interesting, I don't think you ever showed at the ACP, did you?
Me, yes, several times.
Oh, you did?
You must have missed it.
Okay.
In fact, with liquid light emulsion thing.
Okay, oh, that's good. That's good.
But
I mean, it's a pity in a way. I mean, here I am because I once worked there myself. And so partly the reason I agreed to come was this is the last weekend of the ACP and I wanted to be a part of that. But it's a pity that as it, let's pretend, transmutes to something else, that we haven't had a bit of an opportunity to actually track back through that history. Remember, as I say, I mean, in my short engagement with it, the many, many people who put in many, many hours, first to make that thing possible and then to keep it going over these 41 years, and the many, many artists who've shown there and perhaps would not have been able to show anywhere else. I mean, that situation has changed, but certainly in the 70s and the 80s, that was the place where you went to do...
But it was also quite experimental. It certainly wasn't governed
Dennis Del Favreau's installations were shown there, you remember? I mean, unbelievable things. Yeah. Sorry. Did you have a question? Or was that you were just commenting on that nostalgic thing?
I think I've sort of lost it.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess I have sort of got a comment. In looking at... I mean, one of the limitations, I think, if you stay within that process-driven engagement with photography, is you'd have to argue, though, that the palette is quite limited to a degree. I do feel like we look back at the past at those photos and we look at more contemporary versions of it, and I do feel like I've seen that before, you know what I mean? Because I guess if you were working... I mean, I just think there's a danger we can fetishise our processes in photography because we're a bit self-conscious about ourselves as a medium in art.
Yeah.
Whereas if we said that about a painter, do you know what I mean? It's like I just think we have to be careful that we don't become a bit self-conscious about those.
The weakness of my talk, but it's a necessary weakness, is that I'm talking very generically. And really what we should be doing is going into the individual clusters of work in the show.
True.
Because they're not all the same. They may have some vague things in common, which I tried to outline, but of course, in fact, each individual body of work is actually quite different, and I suspect if you talk to the individual artists, they don't actually necessarily embrace the premise itself anyway. They just happen to find themselves in an interesting group show. And coming back to what you're saying, obviously Kathy Rogers' work, which is an interesting little signpost as you come into the show, is very grounded in a very specific historical event with some very specific politics to do with, of course, Lindy Chamberlain and women and the media and child motherhood. And it's quite of a shock in a way to see how grounded that work is relative to some of the younger artists who are experimenting with the medium but without the same kind of grounding in an actual specific event, politics and so on. So, I mean, that's a good, interesting conversation we could have about which of these works is the most effective, which is the most resonant.
But I'll make one last comment on all of that, is that also many artists, this is not necessary, like David Haynes and Joyce Interding, this is not just their only form of practice.
No, of course.
And I would argue that a lot of those early photographers, Jackie Redgate, etc., went into making objects and all sorts of things. So, I mean, it's not just the only vehicle.
No, like I say, it's a pity that we don't have a kind of series of exhibitions tracking the history of the ACP and in effect tracking our own history, the last 40 years of it anyway. But I think probably we've run out of time for this. But we're going to continue because Ben Kalki knows everything there is to know about refugees coming to us from Germany, and we'll be able to solve the world's problems, right, Ben?